Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thanks so much for being here this afternoon. My name is Erell Hubert, and I'm the director of the School for Advanced Studies in the Arts and Humanities. I'm really pleased to be presenting our third talk in this year's SASAH Speakers Series with Dr. Erell Hubert. More on that soon. But first, we'll begin with a territorial land acknowledgement. And I know that we're gathering on screen today from many different places, but the home of SASAH, Western University, is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Nunapewak, and Chinanton peoples, as well as the Huron-Wendat. This land is associated with several treaties, including Treaty 6 London, London Township, Treaty 7 Sombra Township, Treaty 21 Longwoods, and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. We respect the longstanding relationships that Indigenous nations have to this place, as they are the contemporary stewards of the land. And we acknowledge historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples endure in Canada. And we accept our responsibility as a public institution to contribute toward revealing and correcting miseducation, as well as renewing respectful relationships with Indigenous communities through our teaching, our research, and our community service. I'm going to introduce Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at Western, Michael Milday, who will make some welcoming remarks, and then Dr. Elena Robin, the Chair of Visual Arts, will introduce today's speaker. And we should have some time after the presentation for some questions. So, Dean Milday.
Thank you very much, Ara, and thank you very much for that land acknowledgement, which I think helps to remind us that in these rather complicated times that we're living with pandemics and political strife all around us, we as academics and as people of the university, we have to remember that we have multiple tasks and multiple obligations, and we have to think about all the things that we have to do. Including things of long standing, which we can't lose sight of given just the immediate pressures that we face. I think also the land acknowledgement today is going to be particularly relevant to some of the conversation that we're going to have with Erell Hubert, who I'm delighted to welcome to the faculty and to Western, even if it is only virtually. Great pleasure to have you here. A proper introduction will follow from Elena Robin. The idea of museums and the role of universities can sometimes be sort of fairly closely connected. This idea of repositories of knowledge and their interaction with the general population and its immediate sort of political context and its general sort of community orientation towards challenges. There's parallels there. And so it's a really great pleasure to welcome a researcher from a companion institution. And I will now turn it over to Elena to do the proper introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Ara, for organizing this event. Dr. Erell Hubert is a curator of pre-Columbian art at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. She holds a Ph.D. in archaeology from the University of Cambridge. Her fieldwork-based research explores the roles of material culture in processes of identity negotiation in pre-Hispanic and colonial contexts along the north coast of Peru. At the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, Dr. Hubert was associate curator for the exhibition Peru, Kingdoms of the Sun and the Moon, which was presented in 2013, and was co-curator of the Arts of One World, the new permanent galleries, which opened in November 2019, overseeing, among others, the galleries devoted to the arts of Latin America. In her curatorial work at the museum, she addresses questions of materiality, object biography, and human-object relations. She also raises some concern about illegal trafficking of antiquities. Dr. Hubert has been a sessional lecturer at the University of Toronto, Concordia, and the Université de Montréal. Erell and I have collaborated for many years in a joint effort to raise academic visibility and scholarly recognition of art from Latin America in Canada. The Montreal Museum of Fine Arts is the Canadian institution with the most extensive and impressive collection of artworks from Latin America with more than 1,000 pre-Columbian objects and more than 250 items from the colonial era up to today. It is the most active Canadian institution to acknowledge and value the presence of Latin American art of all eras in their collection through permanent display and temporary exhibitions. Dr. Hubert is currently working on an exhibition that is forthcoming at the Montreal Museum of Fine Art in 2023, of which the details are still a mystery, but I'm sure it's going to be very exciting. And Erell is also looking forward to do some field work in Peru this summer, and we wish her the best of luck in her research. Thank you, Erell, for agreeing to be with us tonight, even though it's on Zoom, and for sharing your expertise. Thank you. It's very nice to have you with us. And if you want to share your screen, your presentation is entitled Being an Archaeologist in the Fine Art Museum, Scientific and Ethical Challenges of Working with Unproveninced Collections. Welcome.
Thank you very much for that introduction, quite complimentary introduction too, and for inviting me to give the talk, and for everyone for coming, or connecting rather, to this talk. Here is the slide. So the first image that I chose is a bit to represent what the title says, this challenge of dealing with being both an archaeologist in the North American sense of the term, in that I've been trained in anthropology departments rather than art history departments, and most of my research, my master's, my PhD, were fieldwork based, so working with collections coming out of scientific excavations in Peru. And trained, it means that I was very much trained in understanding those collections based on the archaeological context of them. And the image on the left that you see here is a piece that was found during excavations in 2018. And so we have specific context. While I've been at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts officially as a curator, I've done some work before for the museum, but since 2016. And it is not only a museum, but a fine arts museum, which means that we don't have the archaeological context of the pieces in the collection. We have over 1,200 pre-Columbian or pre-Hispanic pieces from various countries, from Mexico to Chile, in the collection, but only one has kind of a tiny manuscript notes in the archival file saying found in a mound on the ranch of Lord so-and-so in North Mexico. For everything else, it's pieces that were acquired on the art market. So by people who were attracted to the aesthetics, the exoticness of the pieces, but did not necessarily have a very strong interest for the specific archaeological origin, the specific original meaning or use of those pieces. And so what I know about them is basically who gave them to the museum, when and where they bought it, and not even that sometimes for the older ones, because the collection was actually started in the first half of the 20th century, in 1916, with the opening of the museum section, which was meant to be holding objects for the education of the artist and the artisan. And so that's when kind of things other than European paintings and sculptures came in the collection. And so today it's a little bit of how to deal with both intellectual scientific challenges of approaches within the discipline of archaeology that rely on information that is unavailable in museums, and also the ethical challenge with everything linked to looting, but also to colonial relations, to inequity between the North and the South. So it's a little bit what we're going to explore today. I chose 5 main challenges to discuss, but of course there would be enough probably to do a whole seminar on, whole session on it. And so I'm starting with looking at how we understand isolated works in a collection, in that I have this double chambered bottle as part of the collection that was offered to the museum in 2010 by Sybil and David Fleming, who had inherited it from their parents, who had bought it from a gallery in Montreal, and then I don't know much more for the provenance. So how do I tell a story with it? How do I talk about this piece? The first step is to look at similar pieces in other collections. Here I'm showing you pieces from the Ethnological Museum in Berlin and the British Museum in London. And as you can see, photographs depend on if there's a curator interested in the piece. So we have a better photo for Montreal because I requested that photograph. And so we can talk about the appearance linked to the technology used to make the pieces. So the blackness, the black color of the piece is not due to paint, but rather to the firing technique, the firing process used, which what we call a reductive firing without oxygen. Then I can say it depicts the moon goddess, who is one of the main deities among the Chimu Empire. So that gives me my identification as a piece from Chimu archaeological culture that was on the north coast of Peru from the 10th to the 15th century CE. And from that, I can talk a little bit about the Chimu Empire as an expansionist empire on the north coast, about processes, about the history of the moon goddess as associated with the moon, but also with the sea. We see waves and fish here, but everything that I can say will always be about the type of vessel rather than this specific bottle in itself. And so most of our identifications rely on analogies. When we rely on analogies for all these three pieces, the most I can say is that they come from the north coast, from in between where you see Tucume and Chanchan. But then we can try and understand a little bit more by archaeological discoveries, scientific archaeological discoveries. And so I work recently, well, I've been working for the past few years, hoping to be back on the field this summer. We haven't been able to be back as travel, as you know, was very difficult, hoping to have a field school in the Nipeña Valley, so towards the southern part of the Chimu territory. We work more specifically in a site called Pan de Azúcar, which is the nickname of the hill, where you have a platform on top and then a series of mounds, the ones with the little numbers, where each mound has a building on them. And when we excavated in 2018, Mound 2 in the southern part of the site, we were able to find a series of offerings. 2 burials, 1 disturbed burial of an adult, 1 still enveloped child, and an offering of artifacts next to them. Probably a votive offering that was linked to the later occupation and abandonment of that building, because more or less at the same level, we found a layer of burning that seems to be the closing event for the occupation of the building. Among that pile of artifacts that was clearly put there intentionally, we have that bottle that is very, very, very close to the one in the Montreal collection, from the shape of the headdress of the moon goddess, from the object that she's holding, from the cross, the X at the back part of the treble chambered vessel, the shape of the spout. So we can think that the one in Montreal might have come from maybe the southern part of the Chimu Empire, might have been deposited as a votive offering we cannot confirm it, but we now have scientific excavated examples that allows us to go a bit further in our hypotheses about the work. And we know because of this, the state of preservation, complete objects usually come from votive offerings, caches, and funerary offerings, tombs, because they were deposited, then the context was closed off, and that's how they were preserved. While everyday plates tend to be found in fragments. We find thousands and thousands of fragments for a single complete object. However, beyond knowing the actual archaeological geographical context of the piece, what's something that's very important also is that it was not found alone. It was found with 7 other ceramic vessels. Here we have an example of a sea lion shaped cántaro or jar with 7 gourds, one of them containing cotton, with a wooden cup with textile tools such as spindles, a bracelet made of seeds that still had the cotton thread holding the seeds together, 6 pieces of clothing. Here you have an example of a complete tunic and a ball of wool. And so even when you see what appears to be complete works in museums, they are in a way fragments in that, contrary to modern art, which is often created in terms, especially Western modern art, created as a unique piece, as self-standing in a way, a lot of archaeological objects were never really meant to be seen or used in an isolated manner. And so what we see is a fragment of a wider assemblage. Those fragments also often exclude more fragile objects such as textiles. But if we look at the offerings, most of the remains are actually organic remains, and with a clear emphasis on the importance of textile production, of artistic textile production among the Chimu. And that brings me to my second challenge, which is what we see, what is visible versus what is invisible in museums, and how we acknowledge biases within our collections. Because when you work on the field and then you work with a museum collection, you become very aware that what you're showing, what you're working with in museum collection is not actually what you find on the field, is not actually what people at the time would have seen and experienced. Here, I'm staying in the same area of the north coast of Peru. I chose examples that were close to where my specialty is. It works for any other region, of course. But moving to the first millennium, so a bit before the Chimu, you had the Moche. And those are archaeological cultures in that they do seem to correspond to the socio-political polity and network, but they are defined based on bounded, spatially and chronologically bounded assemblages of material culture. We don't know if they're culture in terms of self-identification of the people, of course. And so the first bias for the Moche is the absolute fascination for precious metals, especially gold. Most of golden objects, Moche, are not actually very gold-based. It's copper with a bit of gold to make them look very shiny. But the exhibition that Elena mentioned in the introduction that I co-curated while I was a PhD student had over a third of the objects, the Moche objects presented, made of precious metals. And as I would say, nearly every single exhibition on the art of Peru in general in the past 10 or 15 years used the golden Moche artifact as the emblem, the emblematic image of the exhibition. Here you see the cover of the exhibition catalog with the frontal part of a headdress. Frontal part of a headdress that was looted in a site probably called La Mina, but was actually seized by Scotland Yard in 2006 in London before being returned to Peru. So we're quite lucky to have it in Montreal in 2013 because it was one of the first times coming out after being restituted to Peru. However, we have no metal moche objects in the Montreal collections. And during excavation at a moche site called Guadalupito, just one valley north of where the site of Pan de Azúcar is, we found less than 1% of all the artifacts were made of metal. And the types of artifacts we find, I mean, I've never found anything of the type that's represented on the exhibition catalog, is more this type of metal. So little needles, little broken pieces. And so it's what represents over a third of what's shown to the public in an exhibition is actually a tiny, tiny, tiny part of the art of the moche. And the same thing is true for ceramic vessels. You have a lot of shapes for ceramic vessels. You have bowls, you have jars, you have plates, you have bottles, but it's nearly always the bottles that are collected and that are displayed. There is a very specific shape that's characteristic of the North Coast that lasts throughout all the archaeological cultures of the North Coast, which is the stirrup spout bottle. And what we call the stirrup spout is this specific shape that sometimes has been interpreted as a symbolic way to talk about complementarity in Indian thought of one becoming two, becoming one. Because it's actually not really useful. If you try to pour some liquid out of these bottles, there's really no practical use for choosing such a shape for the spout. The two on the left are part of the Montreal collection. This type of bottle was over 3/4 of the ceramic vessels that presented in the exhibition in 2013. Whoops, moving too fast. And all of the ceramic vessels in the Montreal collection are bottles. We have one other moche object, which is tunic, a textile tunic. I'll probably try to show it soon, but textiles require rotations for conservation purposes. However, once again, if you look at excavations, these types of bottles make up less than 10% of the ceramic vessels that we find. The one on the right is one of those bottles that we found in a tomb, unfortunately a looted tomb at the site of Guadalupito, but it's very rare, not only to find bottles, but to find even more rare to find complete bottles. And there has been for a few dozens of years now, discussions when we talk about modern contemporary historical Western art about the fact that the artists that were represented in museums excluded in large part from the canon a lot of women, of artists of color. We might do a little bit the same when we collect, we have our biases in archaeology. We need to think about what we're presenting, who it was meant for, who made it. We know that women were involved in ceramic production. However, we also know that those stirrup spout bottles are very much associated with the ruling elite, with elite practices within moche society. And when you look at the distribution of those bottles within burials, they are more often associated with male burials than female burials, even when burials are of the same status. And so are we presenting in museum the dominant male-dominated elite discourse of the moche through art? That's a question that we need to think about, because most moche people, and maybe that's another discussion of what we call art and what we call craft, in that those divisions do not really exist in the same way in most of the world and most of periods of history. But most of the time, even from a high status or low status compound, you find these types of jars, undecorated jars, but you also find a wide range of other types of decorated material. And so we have those questions of, we are in a way building what it means, what people expect moche art, chimu art, whichever style, to look like. And even within museum, that influences future collecting. So it's self-reinforcing in a way, because early collecting sets the standards for everything else. And it not only sets the standards for specific types of objects, but it can also bring difficulties in determining the authenticity of the work. When we work with archaeological material, authenticity is simply defined as, was that object made in the right time period, in the right area, or was it made in 1920 when it's supposed to have been made 2,000 years earlier? And so that's easier if I also work with the African and Oceanic collection at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. That's an even more complicated question when we move into more recent work. But in this case, on the left, you have an example of a bottle in a wari style that was purchased in 1948 by the then curator of the museum section that I've mentioned at the very beginning. So that part of the museum that included objects other than painting and sculpture as an authentic wari vessel. And we can see with the one from the Metropolitan Museum of Art what it is based on, more or less. So the shape is similar. You do have, it's not exactly the same motif, but the bird motif that you have here, we find it on wari style material on the field, especially on the coast rather than the heartland of the wari, which is in the highlands of Peru. So this is more kind of the coastal version of the wari. And until very recently, at least until my arrival, it was very much considered as an authentic wari vessel. And I wanted to show during the reinstallation of the rooms, I was like, oh, well, it's a bit a shame that we don't have much representation of Highland artistic production. And I was like, we have two wari vessels, let's show them. And the first vessel, like, this is clearly fake because under the pigment, there is a layer of bright white material that wasn't used at the time. For this one, I was a bit unsure, so I contacted a specialist at the Cleveland Art Museum who had recently done a wari exhibition, who sent me to another specialist who has a database of fakes, who told me, well, I really think this is a fake. Some elements with the upper figure with the S shape are found in other fake bottles. And so part of the way we are, when we don't have archaeological context, there is not enough knowledge, I would say, or enough standardization. We're not talking about the hand of a single artist. We're not talking about something that was strictly controlled in terms of standardization. And so it is normal that there is variation among archaeological productions. And connoisseurship is basically never enough to say this is definitely authentic, this is definitely fake. Sometimes like this doesn't work. if there's a problem with technique, as I mentioned, with the other wary vessel in the collection, or very anachronic elements. Sometimes it's just the feel of it. One bottle that I consider fake in the collection, I consider it fake because it doesn't weigh enough. When I take it, it's just not the right feel of it. But chemical analysis are basically essential to confirm it. But a well-made, thorough analysis probably costs about $1,000. If we want to do everything archaeological in the collection, unless there's a very, very wealthy donor, we're never going to date them. So we're relying on probably authentic, probably fake. And so we do have pieces that have now been shown to be probably fake. We have other pieces where we might move the other way. This is a small figurine that was not bought on the market, but rather gifted to the museum by Émile Vaillancourt, who in the 1950s was the Canadian ambassador to Peru. He gave about 20, 30 pieces, Peruvian pieces. Some of them are very, very strange. There's quite a few figurines. It's most likely that they're pieces that when he was traveling throughout Peru, he either bought at a market in Peru or was gifted by someone and then brought it back. And as soon as he came back to Montreal, gave everything to the museum. So he did not have necessarily a super strong interest for the art of Peru. And it is an unusual figurine. And when a specialist, I won't say her name out of respect, came in 1980 to analyze, in our defense, she did the whole collection in 2 weeks to analyze the collection. She described this figurine as not having much of a relationship to anything ancient. And so it has been entered in our database as of doubtful authenticity. And that's what's still written today in the database. Nothing, not much of a relationship to anything ancient. And I would probably have followed that conclusion myself if I hadn't done a PhD on figurines, on moche figurines, but meaning that I read tons of stuff about figurines across Peru and had seen during my PhD research photos of similar ones that came out of the ground. The one at the bottom don't have a scientific archaeological context, but they were collected in the early 20th century by Edward Gaffron. They're now in Munich, but we know that he was going through and basically looting the sites during the early 20th century. And we have the region where they come from, so Huacho region. And much more recently, scientific excavations at Cerro Colorado, also in the Huacho region, have found fairly similar figurines in a tomb. And so rather than being a fake, because it does have a relationship to ancient things, so the conclusion was wrong, it might simply be something that is not a canonical style, a well-known style. It's not moche, it's not chimu, it's not wari, it's not those large states of empire or empires that created those very popular styles that have been collected since the beginning of colonization in Peru, and might be more of a localized artistic expression and was cast aside from being displayed to the public because it did not fit the expectations. But those expectations, as I said, are self-fulfilling in that someone at one point decides that this is what it should look like, and then everyone follows. So more and more excavations allow us to question those assumptions. Because if we compare with the situation in classics, for example, with Greek and Roman art, there is a much longer, much more ancient tradition of excavation. And so most of the material that we have for Peru until the 1970s, there was no scientific excavation. It was collection made of mixed works looted and works bought on various markets. And so even for ancient collections, it's possible that it's a mix of modern and ancient works in the same style. And most of our knowledge of pre-Columbian styles was built before we had archaeological information about those people that made the different art styles. And why are we making fake? That kind of ends my section on the more intellectual challenges of about Peru. But in moving into ethical, here we're a bit in the middle of both, in that you create fake because there's a market, because there's commodification of those materials. And so that brings us with the history of that commodification and how do we work with historical collections. I've mentioned a few times the term looting. The way those collections came to be built would be today unacceptable. And looting and collections started from the colonial arrival of the Spanish in Peru, in Mexico, across Latin America. However, for the early colonial period, you have more stories of them melting the gold for the material than actually collecting. And the vast majority of collections across Europe, across North America today, and even across Latin America, were built up in the 19th, early 20th century. Were built up in a way, as I mentioned, that we would not accept today. When I work on the field, every single fragment remains. As soon as I finish field work, I enter them to the Ministry of Culture. Everything is weight, has their weight inscribed in a catalog. And if I want to have access to them again, I need to apply for a permit. It is property of the nation. If I want to export temporarily or even a sample, even a little piece of maize, I need to apply for a permit also. So it's very, very different from what's today. And even though Latin American countries, when they gained their independence in the first half of the 19th century, most of them, like Mexico and Peru, fairly quickly passed laws that do mention protecting archaeological heritage by prohibiting the export without proper permission outside of the country. Those permissions were either given very easily or those laws were just not enforced. There's about a century of attempts at creating the National Museum in Lima, with collections entering and disappearing from the museum before it settled in the form that it has today. It also is a different situation from, let's say, when we work with African material, African artworks, because African collections were built up, most of them were collected under colonial rule and include figures or other objects that were still in use or recently in use by the people. Here we're working with archaeological material, and a lot of the collecting and then selling internationally was done by the rising Peruvian middle class. It's the case for this little goblet. The photo is not the best. I don't know why. I think the photograph, the photographer at the museum didn't really understand the motif. So photographed the side of the motif rather than the main spider. But what we know of this very old little goblet from a very wide range of date, about 1,000 millennium, where we cannot really place it any more precisely because we haven't found yet those in scientifically excavated archaeological contexts on the North Coast, was given to the museum by F. Cleveland Morgan, but thankfully we have his notes about his collection, and he bought it from a New York dealer who had bought it from Rafael Larco. Rafael Larco is a very important collector in Lima, a Peruvian collector, that was not only a collector, but also an early archaeologist using methods that was more treasure hunting than archaeological excavation, but still with an interest for the chronology of the works that he would find in the sites. And so Rafael Larco is actually the one who basically developed the chronology that we're still using up to this day in Peru, on the north coast of Peru, and published it. So he's half a looter, half an archaeologist. And he has his collection has been the basis of the private Larco Museum in Lima. And this is just to give you an idea of the amount of objects that are included. Just for the Moche, there's over 15,000 artifacts in their collections. And this is the open storage, where you just have shelves upon shelves of Unproveninced stirrup spout bottles, which is very useful for the study of stylistic variability. I've done quite a few studies on gender representations and everything using the Larco collection. And we do have information sometimes about valley-wide, but nothing more, unfortunately. And so this is a discussion also, because there is the ethical discussion about inequity between North and South, and that you have, of course, a lot more movement of objects coming from the South towards Europe and North America than on the other direction. You have maybe a more nationalist discourse about restitution of works that have been looted, sending them back to Peru, to Mexico, to Guatemala, to Panama, Colombia, etc., when they request them. You also have another concern for archaeologists, which is when a piece is in the living room of a wealthy person in Lima or a wealthy person in Montreal, it's still not available to the public. It still has lost its archaeological context. And so what we want to work against is the destruction of archaeological heritage via looting. And this is the last challenge that I want to talk about today, which is how do we as archaeologists and curators contribute to protecting archaeological heritage? In museums, we're in a particularly complicated position because the collections come from looting, but they come from looting at a period when it was tolerated. But as an archaeologist, I've seen firsthand the impact that it has on archaeological remains. Here is actually my very first experience of excavation in Peru. Was the first 2 weeks. It was a project by the University of Montreal. Was spent trying to document what was left of a looted cemetery. We are right in the middle of the cemetery there, and every hole that you see is a looter's hole. And you see that some of them are more rectangular because they're actually rubbed out graves. And so the only thing that we can do is measure everything, describe everything, try to salvage the little information left, the little dignity of the people that were buried there. And because you see like the bone just thrown out to the side. And it does make you very, very conscious after spending 2 weeks just measuring out robbed graves, how horrible the impact of looting is. And I want to highlight here that the solution is not to criminalize first level looters, the ones that actually dig the holes. Because you cannot really blame someone if selling a single piece of pottery that was found by digging a hole behind their fields allows them to feed their family for a whole month. What we need to work on is in the country of origin, try to promote economic development for those communities. That's why when we work in Nepeña, near the site of Pan de Azúcar, we do have a community development aspect that comes with it, but mostly attack the buyer's side of this commodification of archaeological heritage. And it is not a new concern. As I mentioned, a lot of Latin American countries already in the 19th century were writing it into law. But from an international standpoint, one of the main events in protecting archaeological heritage is the UNESCO Convention on the means of prohibiting and preventing the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property. And so that convention from 1970 states that this illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership is one of the main causes of the impoverishment of the cultural heritage of the countries of origin of such property, and that international cooperation constitutes one of the most efficient means of protecting each country's cultural property against all the dangers resulting therefrom. To this end, the state parties undertake to oppose such practices with the means at their disposal, and particularly by removing their causes, putting a stop to current practices, and by helping to make the necessary reparations. This is quite vague. There are more details in other articles. This is just the beginning of the convention. However, it depends on when countries ratify the convention. Canada is actually one of the earliest buyers countries that ratified it in 1978. But if I look at Europe, France ratified it in 1997, the UK in 2002, Germany in 2007. And so they're using that date as the cutoff date for acquisitions. There is also the fact that it is not actually legally binding, meaning that it is nearly more of a recommendation and that to be legally binding, there needs to be a bilateral agreement between the country of origin and the country where the piece is sold. And so once again, not legally binding, but something that came out a whole 38 years after the adoption of the UNESCO Convention is guidelines published by the American Association of Museum Directors, or the Association of American Museum Directors, one or the other, that states that member museums normally should not acquire work unless provenance research substantiates that the work was outside of its country of probable modern discovery before 1970, or was legally exported from its probable country of modern discovery after 70. So the second part means if, for example, there is a government-approved export permit for the piece, which basically never happens for archaeology. And so those are the guidelines. We're actually rewriting the collection management policy right now in Montreal, and those are the guidelines that we are following. Meaning that if a donor offers me, and it happens recently not for pre-Columbian collection, because I deal with a lot of the archaeological material that comes in the museum. With the donor having bought pieces in the 2000s and having no previous provenance for a lot of them, I do not accept them at the museum. It does mean that those pieces will go back to the art market and will probably disappear from public knowledge. It is a compromise, this kind of arbitrary date of 1970, so that old collections that come from the very long period where protection of archaeological heritage was not at the forefront of preoccupations, that those collections can still be preserved in public institutions, but that museums are not complicit in more recent looting. And that's why we chose kind of this arbitrary date. However, speaking with donors and collectors, most of them have never heard of that convention, even though it's over 50 years old now. And so sales continue. This is an example of a sale that took place last Friday. I had another one, and then when I saw that one popped up, I chose a more recent one. Here, because I talked about the moche, you see one of the examples of the pieces on sale, which is a syrup spout bottle showing a sleeping warrior. It was evaluated, I'm not sure what price it went for, but it was evaluated to about 2,000 euros, which, thinking of the art market, is not that much, but thinking of Peru, where it originated from, it's about 6 times the average monthly salary of a Peruvian. And it would not have been accepted in the museum in Montreal. The only date that we have is 1988. And it is also sold in Paris. And in fact, in recent years, Paris is the main place where pre-Columbian material has been sold, in part because anything that is before the ratification of France of the convention in 1997 is accepted for auction houses. And that's probably why there's been, in November last year, and then more recently, specifically in relation to this sales, statement made by embassies, by Latin American embassies in France. This is a statement that came out on the 8th of February by the embassies of Ecuador, Guatemala, Mexico, Panama, Peru, and the Dominican Republic. So the countries where the works on sale during that auction came from. And in that statement, they reaffirmed, because the previous statement had been published in November, that auctions encourage the looting, illicit trafficking, and laundering of property perpetrated by transnational organized crime. It undermines modern archaeology by promoting illegal excavation aimed at extracting objects and preventing them from being researched, thus hindering knowledge related to ancient civilizations. Deprive the stolen pieces of their cultural, historical, and symbolic essence by making them mere decorative objects for individuals. Prejudice cooperation between states in the field of the protection and conservation of cultural heritage. Undermine the integrity of cultures and therefore of all of humanity. Promote the counterfeit market. So rather than doing a conclusion, I'm using a little bit this statement that is quite strong, and I think is quite of a exemplifies the new age in which we are entering regarding our relationship to the international movement and sale of archaeological material, and end my presentation on this and use it as an opening for maybe a period of questions. So I'll stop the sharing.
Erell, that was fabulous. Thank you so much. There are so many different questions that you've raised about what we're seeing when we visit a museum, and then about all the other activity that goes on around in the context of the museum. As you know, your talk today was arranged partly to complement a course that's being taught in SASAH as part of the curriculum project. And the course is Dr. Erell Hubert's course on art from Latin America in Canada. And we have two students here on the panel who will lead off the question period, but I would invite anybody in the audience to please type your question into the Q&A, because we will have time. We'll have a little bit of time as well to address some of those. So maybe I will start off by inviting Margaret Glede from Erell Hubert's class to ask a question.
Thank you. And thank you so much for your talk. That was fantastic to listen to. I love hearing about different kind of ethical dilemmas. So that was very, very interesting. And actually, this kind of goes back to your portion of the presentation or of your talk about unauthentic artifacts that you already have in collections. I recently did a project actually for this class as well on the Zapotec urns that were found to be unauthentic. So I was wondering if you think there would be any value in actually doing an exhibit that would be composed entirely of kind of unauthentic artifacts that still have like historical context.
Yes, and I think the Zapotec urns are an excellent example, actually, because one of my teacher as an undergrad did his PhD on fake Zapotec urns, wrote his whole PhD on the topic, and you can actually follow stylistic trends of when those fakes were made, where at one point you have Zapotec urns that have a Napoleonic type shape hat that were made during the Napoleonic period, and things like that. And I do have a fake Maya figurine on display next to authentic ones to talk a bit about those questions. So yes, there has been a few small ones, maybe more in university museums, but I can already tell you that there has been interest in probably doing something around the theme of authenticity, in showing fakes, but also there's probably a bit wider the theme of authenticity in the museum in Montreal. I know there's also a contemporary artist, an American-Mexican contemporary artist that was interested in doing a piece using fakes from our collection. So there is an interest in actually not only hiding them as something shameful, but something that is part of the history of the collection, the history of our relationship to archaeological material.
Thanks so much for your question, Margaret. And I'll call also on Cole van der Velden from the same class to pose his question.
Yes, thank you, Ara, and thank you, Dr. Hubert. My question centers back to what we kind of ended on in terms of current collectors of these antiquities. And I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to what continues to motivate private collectors in this current moment. Because the statement that you displayed for us there from the embassies seems to speak quite generally on like a governmental and an institutional level. What can we be doing to raise awareness on a more individual and even like a corporate level to de-incentivize collection, or even just bring it more to the fore of like a public discussion? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, well, it's something, I mean, when I talk about the challenges, it's also, let's say the people I interact with on the field and the people I interact with at openings in the museums are not exactly the same and don't necessarily have the same opinion about collecting. And it's something that's quite complex. And I must say that the talk that I gave today represents my position. it's not necessarily the best way. I mean, I did write it and the director is perfectly okay with it, that my role at the museum is not to expand the collection that much. Talking with collectors, in the last acquisition committee that we have those acquisition committee, both where we have an external panel, and a lot of the panelists are collectors themselves. And so I took that opportunity to actually present what I presented to you, the convention and the guidelines, because they were not aware of it. And I think part of it is just the art market doesn't talk about that, because the goal of the market is to sell. And treating archaeological material as inalienable works kind of goes against the very reality of the art market. And of course, controlling the art market, the legal art market, will not change much. There's about 90% of it that goes through the illegal art market. It's among the four main ones, with arms, drugs, and human trafficking. Art trafficking is about the same level of all those traffics. And in Peru, sometimes they export drugs in archaeological vessels. So they do a 2-in-1. But for collectors, the ones that I've been working with, I explain to them the importance of provenance, in that if they do want to continue to collect, because I cannot just tell them stop, what motivates them is they like to have those pieces with them in their house. I don't really understand it, but they like to have those pieces with them in their house, is to tell them, well, at least if you're collecting, and a lot of collectors are also thinking that at one point they will give it to a museum. A good argument is, if you want to give it to a museum at one point, you cannot buy something without provenance anyway. You will be stuck with it. And when things will evolve, you won't be able to sell it. You won't make back your money, because when people give to museum, they get a tax break also, which that might not be what we want, but it's very much the reality of why a lot of people give to museums. And so explaining to them in those terms, further than that, is very complicated, because it's such a different way of conceptualizing those works. And even I still use quite a lot the word object for Peru, but when you arrive with certain types of materials, working, for example, with the Arhuaco of Colombia, or you work with the Yoruba in Nigeria, they're not even objects. They are alive. So then we're entering an ontological discussion. So the best way that I found for now is to really highlight the importance of provenance, and a bit using the fact that they want to be able to have their name as a donor for the museum as an argument for them to pay attention to provenance, if they're not convinced by the actual protection of archaeological heritage.
Thank you so much for that, Cole. That was a great question. We can now open it up to the audience on screen, and we've got a couple of questions that have come in. The first one is from Randall Pogrzewski, who's chair of our classics department. And he writes, thanks very much for an interesting talk. Western and SASAH have recently emphasized community engagement. I wonder if you would talk a little more about the relationships between archaeologists and the local landowners and workers in the areas where they excavate.
So it depends on the archaeologist. So I can talk about my own experience working. So we work directly with the community. Pan de Azúcar is near a small town called Nepeña. It's a very small town. And we have a good relationship, and we keep in contact with them throughout the year. Like, we're not just popping in the summer and then leaving. We exchange emails and everything throughout the year. Something that's important for us, we are involved with the community. So when we arrive, we do a community presentation of why we're here. Before we leave, we present the results first to the community before any publications or anything else. We tell them this is what we found. We show them photo, we explain, because sometimes a difficulty for them is, what is the difference between an archaeologist and a looter? They're digging a hole, they're taking the object, and then it disappears because it goes into storage somewhere in a museum. Now in Peru, there is much more development of regional and local museums, and that's something that we want to work on. There's another city that's called Moro, that's not too far from Peña, that has now regional museums. So try to see if we can organize exhibitions of the works that we found in Peña locally to show them what we found. From a more economic point of view, what we do is, well, we pay well, let's say. The salary that we give in 2 months to our workers that work with us is probably as much as what they make working in sugarcane plantations for the rest of the year. We're paying above the average salary. We're also renting houses. We're going to restaurants. We're bringing 15 foreigners in the village for 2 months, 3 months every year. And that's actually quite an important economic input for them. And we've now established such a good relations that they protect the site for us. There is nearly no looting in the site we're working from 1 year to another, because it's much more advantageous for them to have us come in every year than try to sell a few pieces. And when we talk about landowners, for example, for now, the mounds are not cultivated, but if we were to excavate, and that's something for future years, in areas where you have culture, so a field that's been used, what we do is the area that we excavate, we give to the landowner the equivalent money of what he would get if he had put crops in that area that year. So we pay for his crops that he cannot grow because we're digging a hole in the middle of his field. So it's just treating the people there with respect, both in terms of paying them in a respectful manner and high enough, because I would say that large companies of sugarcanes do not. It's not that high what we're paying them, but it's much higher than those companies. And in terms of sharing information and explaining what we're there and not treating them as kind of decoration. There are collaborators, and they're very knowledgeable. They're much more knowledgeable than us about the area. Sometimes we find a stone and we're like, what is that stone? Is that imported? Is that, and they know, yes, that comes from that hill there. And even for scientific information, their knowledge is very, very important.
Thanks for a great question, Randy. Go to a question from Andrew Nelson from the Anthropology Department. And he's asking, do you find yourself in conflicts with other curators who have other kinds of backgrounds when you put together exhibits using archaeological materials?
I wouldn't say necessarily conflicts. Maybe that's a strong word, but if I take the example of the curatorial team at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, there are 2 archaeologists. So my colleague in Chinese art did her PhD on Bronze Age China. So she's also a trained archaeologist. So she's not practicing as much as I am, but everyone else studied in art history and might not have the same background. That would be the right way of saying it. So, but I feel like we have a very good team. So I suppose it depends once again from one person to another. Sometimes they do trust our expertise as archaeologists. Sometimes it's a bit difficult to explain those notions of kind of provenance and that collecting is not actually a goal for archaeologists, while museums, usually that's the main goal. So trying to explain that we will not actively expand the collection. But I found, especially in recent years, there has been changes in the museum in Montreal. So there were more conflicts before, but now in recent years, it has been possible to really have those discussions openly and have the time to explain. And they've been very, very open to those elements. They've been very interested in developing new archaeological exhibitions, but at the same time, they respect also, there's an exhibition that just opened and the artist wanted to use an Egyptian coffin. And I just said, well, do remember that it's someone's coffin. It's not just a decorative object. So I would like to see how you intend to place it. And he finally decided not to use it. So there's just dialogue and it evolves, but it does take a little bit of time, especially when people are trained, for example, in 19th century art history is the height of this, but it evolves slowly. And I mean, that's one of the good things in working in museum is that you feel that maybe it will change a little bit the way the museum works with archaeological material in future years.
Thank you so much, Andrew Nelson. Now go to a question from Craig Harvey, who's a postdoctoral student working in the classics department and an archaeologist himself. And Craig says, thank you so much for a great presentation. Yes, I agree. I was wondering about the degree to which you or your institution have adopted a philosophy of radical transparency and used the unprovenanced objects that you discussed to introduce issues of provenance, looting, and the ethics of collecting to the general public in gallery displays.
That's actually something that we've been very interested in and that we've attempted to start in the new reinstallation. I'll be honest with you, the new reinstallation is a compromise by the now fired director and us. So there are things that we wanted to show that are not necessarily that visible to the public. They're kind of hidden here and there. But the main idea of the reinstallation is that we were not presenting the arts of the world. We were presenting the Montreal collections of works from Africa, from Latin America, etc., and collections that have their own history. And so we have 6 transversal themes, and one of those themes is consuming cultures. And that talks specifically, for example, we have in each area groupings that show kind of the compulsive collecting of some collectors, where we have hundreds of thousands of the same type of objects. We have that for formative Mexican figurines, and then small Japanese incense boxes and lamps, Roman lamps, like this kind of typological taxonomic collecting. So we show those groupings with the name of the collector to talk about that compulsive collecting. We also, now the main panels for the introduction of each room talks about the general history of that collection, when it started to be collected in Montreal, by who are the main actors, how colonial history of the kind of encyclopedic museum plays into that collecting. We also have labels for specific works where we call them traveling objects, where the label, rather than doing an iconographic or stylistic analysis of the work, is focusing on the itinerary of that object, at least what we know. So giving that transparency within the labels, the groupings, the panels.
Thank you, Craig. I'll now introduce Dr. Beth Green, a CRC chair in Roman archaeology. And she said, and I agree, I loved what you said about objects themselves being fragments, because they were always viewed as part of an assemblage, not individually. Can you expand on how that idea is used when interpreting Latin American material culture broadly?
Yes, so I guess as an archaeologist, we tend to think about the meaning of an object as through their relations to other objects and to people, as a network, rather than as something that needs to be explained individually. And so that's also why we cannot always go all the way into that, because they're fragmented in museum collections, but we have been attempting to recreate groupings rather than kind of have one piece in one case. And so when I present the double-chambered bottle, I present it with two other pieces from the Chimu that present the idea of the moon. And so how you might have different artifacts linked together. If I present a textile, I'll also present spindles and spindle whorls and headdresses that were also on the bodies during burial with the textiles. And for interpretation, that helps us tremendously, because when you look at an assemblage, you get a more general picture of how people interacted with those works, which is what, because I'm anthropologically trained, is what I'm most interested in that I am sometimes a bit confused when there is like a 1 hour discussion on a very specific stylistic type of painting, where I'm like, okay, but why did they make it? And where did they put it in their house? And what did they think about it? What did people think about it? And that's something that I often tell my students, because I've been now teaching in art history for a few years after teaching mostly in anthropological departments, archaeology. And I tend to tell them, if you have an artist and an artwork, often in art history, you'll look at the artist, the life, the biography of the artist to understand the artwork. In archaeology, you look at the artworks, plural, to understand the people and the artist and all the people that use it. So you have the same elements, but you're kind of working in a different direction and working as a network rather than as isolated points.
Thanks, Beth. We don't have any more questions in the Q&A, so maybe I will indulge myself and ask a question that I'm not sure I can formulate really well, but I was really intrigued by this idea of a kind of self-fulfilling expectation, and in particular by a kind of aesthetic that drives curatorial decisions for especially those big splash exhibitions that you want to sell tickets to the public. And it seems to me like curating is telling a story, right? And so we are telling a story that our consumers want to hear, right? And I just wondered if you could comment on that. What is that story that they want to hear? I mean, I know that's a really broad question, but are there any specific characteristics that you might say are elements of the story that sells tickets to the museum?
Well, archaeology actually sells quite a lot of tickets. When we have archaeological exhibitions, they're among the exhibitions that work well with the public. But we find that there is a bit this kind of sensational aspect that sells well. There is still a bit kind of exoticness and the mystery of, and the touching about something. I would say, like, for example, when you exhibit Roman art, it's often Pompeii because of the preservation, but also because of the whole story that surrounds it. Well, you might have great objects from a very mundane site that would be as interesting, but doesn't have kind of that story. And we have a communications department, and so even sometimes for the title of an exhibition, we do a back and forth between the communications department, the director and the curators, so that it's attractive, but it doesn't change too much the meaning the curator wants to give it. And it's the same thing with using gold objects. We know that gold sells. So often curators will say, okay, let's use the gold object as, for the Peru exhibition, our idea for the image at first was a 19th century painting of a Peruvian holding a moche vessel, because the story of the exhibition was how material culture, visual culture was used as an identity anchor and vector throughout Peruvian history. And so we liked that relationship between modern 19th century with archaeological material. But the communications was like, people will not understand. You need to explain too much. So it needs something that's easily grasped for communications. And so we'll use that in exhibitions. But then you can add on those more nuanced stories within the galleries. So we play on both, but most of the time it's a story that can be summarized in one sentence that attracts attention.
Thank you so much. That was really a wonderful talk. And I know that we're all going to go away thinking quite differently than we did before, at least those of us who are not trained in the field, quite differently than before about, again, what we see when we're visiting a museum, what we're paying for when we go into a museum. At this point, I know that there's another event at 7 o'clock, the Active Voice event that some people may be wanting to go to. So seeing that there are no more questions in the Q&A, I'm just going to take a minute or two to offer my thanks to you, Dr. Erell Hubert, for a really wonderful presentation, and to Dr. Lena Robin for her assistance in organizing this and for the idea of inviting this particular guest, which has turned out so beautifully for us all. I would like to thank the student panelists, Margaret Gleed and Cole van der Velden, for their wonderful questions. And I would like to thank Dean Milda and the Faculty of Arts and Humanities for their support, to Melissa Parker and to Jonathan Vickers for technical and administrative support. I would like to remind everyone too, a little brief plug for our final event in the SASAH Speakers Series, which will be on March 24th, when we'll be hosting a CRC chair in Indigenous Arts, Knowledge, Systems, and Education, Spy Denome Welch from the Faculty of Education, who will be speaking about reflections on composing from the land. Spy is a musical composer who uses the sounds of the land in his work. So I hope you'll join us then again. And for now, I want to thanks to everyone in the audience who joined us and wish you all a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Say goodbye to the audience members.